Welcome. This is the fourth week of Advent. As you can see, we have one candle left to light. Christmas is just a couple of days away. And this is the final chapter of the book that we've been reading, Christmas in the Four Gospel Homes by Cynthia M. Campbell, which looks at the Christmas story in each of the Gospels. And the special drawings that we've been using as part of our study are done by Kevin Burns. We began our study with a look at Mark's simple, plain cottage. Not much Christmas going on there at all, but all of the essentials are there. Then we moved on to Matthew's big, rambling Victorian home, with mystery and awe as part of it. Lots of portraits on the walls, lots of family history, and a big intergenerational kind of celebration going on for Christmas. Next, we visited Luke's house. And in Luke's house, there were lots of decorations for Christmas. There was baking going on that we could smell. There were carols blaring from a loudspeaker, and also a live nativity scene in the yard. So a lot of Christmas going on at Luke's home. And today we are going to be taking a look at John's home. You can see from this picture that it is a very different kind of home than anything that we've been looking at so far to date. John's Gospel and John's house are very different from the other three. Like Mark, John doesn't include a birth story about Jesus. He begins many, many years before the birth of Christ. And his gospel starts, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Going all the way back with language that reminds us of the Old Testament book of Genesis and the creation of the world in the beginning. John says this is where the good news about Jesus starts. At the very beginning, the moment of creation, Campbell says, is the beginning of the story of redemption. The story of the beginning of life carries within it the promise that life is stronger than death, and that God has been in control of all of this since the very beginning. So the similarities between John's Gospel and the book of Genesis are very striking. If you read them side by side, especially at the beginning, you would notice that. God's first words of creation were, "Let there be light." And according to the beginning of John, what came into being through the Word, which was there at the beginning, was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, John says, and the darkness did not overcome it. The power of light over darkness. That power has been with us since the creation of the world. And it's both comforting to us and essential to our lives. We have to have light. It's very important to us. But John reminds us that darkness cannot ever overcome the light. He also tells us that darkness can't understand light, can't comprehend what it's all about. Now, we all know the power that light brings to our lives, the hope and the life that comes out of light. And we have also had experiences where we've tried to explain something to someone and they just look at us like we're speaking Greek. They simply can't wrap their minds or their heads around what it is we're saying. Uh, there's nothing about it that makes sense to them, that they can relate to. And John tells us that's the same kind of response that darkness has with light. It just can't understand it, doesn't get it. The things that light says don't make sense to darkness, or don't seem to be truth to darkness. So instead of a story with angels and shepherds and a manger, what we get from the Gospel of John is more about the behind the scenes, the mystery of what has come into being. And what he does for us is explain to us that big theological idea we have that we call incarnation, where the Word becomes flesh. God takes on flesh, becomes incarnate, carnate being flesh, so becomes into flesh in order to be born into the world. And he says that the Word not only created the world and us, but the Word became one of the creatures. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And Campbell says the phrase dwelt among us or lived among us literally means to pitch a tent. She says we might say God moved into the neighborhood. Came to dwell with us, pitched his tent, so he was right there with us. And nothing about us, nothing about being human, joy, sorrow, good, evil, brokenness, or triumph, none of that is alien to God because God understands that. God has become one of us, so understands what being human is all about. Irenaeus, one of the early church fathers, says that God became one of us so that God could make us more like God, more like the intention behind our creation or being created in the image and likeness of God. That's how we were created to be, and we've gotten away from that. We are far from that image now. But Irenaeus says that's why the Word becomes flesh, to restore us to the creatures that we were made to be. John agrees. John says this is why Jesus was born. So, while things were perfect after the creation, but then sin entered the world and entered our lives, Campbell says that John's gospel is the story about getting a second chance. So when it goes back to talking about creation, that reminds us of how things were meant to be and how they can be again. Campbell says what the gospel reminds us is that the longing for a second chance and the energy to struggle for that comes from deep down inside us, where God resides. And in our struggle, we are not alone, because the Word that was with God at creation is now the Word among us, right here and right now. A very hopeful message, isn't it? Well, in talking about John's house, I want to make sure that I'm showing you a good image of this. In talking about John's house, the artist, Kevin Burns, says he thought that John's house needed to reflect the boldness of John's gospel. And it also needed to contrast with the more traditional houses of the other gospels. So Burns envisioned a very modern house with lots of glass, so lots of light, and a geometry that emphasizes its juxtaposition against its wooded context. He pictured a night scene. The observer is advancing through the darkness towards the house. There are woods in every direction. And then the house appears as a brilliant source of light that illumines the path and the surroundings. Once the house has been seen, the observer can't turn away from it. Instead, one is drawn in and invited to explore its surprises and mysteries. As you look at this drawing of John's house, what does it tell you about Jesus' birth? What does it say about his life with us now? How does John's gospel add depth and layers to the story of Jesus' birth? How does it help us understand it better? Burns says the Gospel of John is not so much another story about a man who is trying to teach us what God is about. It is a gospel that presents a man who actually is the essence of God. So not someone telling us about God, but God coming to teach us about who God is. Do you agree with him? Think about these questions as you look at the drawing of John's home and listen to the words of the carol of the Father's love begotten.
Of the Father's love begotten, ere the worlds began to be, He is Alpha and Omega, He the source, the ending, He of the things that are, that have been, and that future years shall see, evermore and evermore. Oh, that birth forever blessed, when the Virgin full of grace, by the Holy Ghost conceiving, bore the Savior of our race, and the babe the world's Redeemer, first revealed his sacred face, evermore and evermore. This is he who sees in old time, chanted of with one accord, whom the voices of the prophets promised in their faithful word. Now he shines along expected. Let creation praise his Lord, evermore and evermore. Let the heights of heaven adore him, angel hosts his praises sing. Cause dominions bow before him, and extol our God and King. Let no tongue on earth be silent, every voice in concert bring.
In our Advent study, we have imagined the homes of each of the four gospel writers and how they would look at Christmas in order to think about where each author puts the good news about Jesus coming. Mark put it with John the Baptist, Matthew with God's promise to Abraham, Luke with the announcement of angels, and then that wonderful Christmas story that we know so well. And John puts it all the way back to the beginning. Each one of these has helped us think about our homes and houses, our celebration of Christmas, what we think is important, and maybe the things that we could set aside because they simply get in the way of what's really going on. But one common source and influence in each of these gospel homes or presentations of the story of Jesus is someone who we may have recognized or may have been quoted or who may simply have been in the background, and that is the prophet Isaiah. Mark quoted Isaiah's words to talk about John the Baptist. Matthew finds the promise of Emmanuel, God with us, in Isaiah's words, and that's an important part of his message to us about Christmas. Luke also uses Isaiah throughout his gospel. One place is at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, when Jesus quotes verses from Isaiah about how the Spirit of the Lord is sending him to bring good news and bind up wounds and free us and proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And John's use of the prophet Isaiah is often more implicit than explicit, especially when he talks about God becoming one of us to be with us. We definitely see Isaiah's influence also in the Gospel of John. Cynthia Campbell reminds us that we too have had guidance from parents and teachers, pastors, friends, others whose words and lives have inspired us, have helped shape our faith and shown us how the promise of God can come to life in our lives, in our homes and houses, just as all four gospel writers relied on Isaiah and other scriptural influences. Campbell says each year when we remember Jesus' birth, the coming of God's Messiah, may we hold in our hearts the hope we learned from our ancestor Isaiah, and may that hope shape our lives in the years to come. I want to thank you for being with me throughout this study. I think it's been an interesting way to look at a very familiar story, to look at different sources from the Bible, and to inspire us to think more deeply about our celebration of Christmas, what it means to us, and how best we can express that in the way we decorate, in the way that we worship and study, in the way that we spend our time preparing for Christmas during Advent, but also celebrating the wonderful birth of our Savior. Let us close with a word of prayer. Though no one has ever seen you, O God, we respond with wonder and awe to the good news that your Son, who is close to your heart, has made you known to us. As we draw near to the time when we celebrate the coming of your Son into the world, make us ever more aware that the Word has been made flesh and dwells among us. Amen. Merry Christmas to you and to all who gather in your home as we celebrate that wonderful news. Emmanuel, God, has come to be with us.